Hello everybody, welcome back. This is History with Hilbert with another Weimar Germany video, and in this one we're going to have a look at Weimar political parties from 1924 through to 1928. So this period is generally known as the Golden Age of the Weimar Republic, and I'll make a few videos addressing whether this actually deserves to be called the Golden Age. But in this one I'm going to be looking at specifically the political parties in some level of detail, what they stood for, who they attracted in terms of voters, and what they did during this period, because this is a period of change, and obviously after this period we see the ascension of the Nazis, which then leads to the Nazis taking over and all the tragedy there. And before this period we see basically the left-wing dominated SPD in government, with several attempts both from the extreme left and the extreme right to take power. So let's have a quick recap of Weimar politics before we begin. Now this is sort of the spectrum of politics which I have addressed here in bright colours for you all to see. So basically at the very far left, the extreme left, we have the KPD. And the KPD, who are in red, are the communists. They are the hardline communists, they are anti-democratic, they want to overthrow the government. Now the USPD are the independent SPD, or the Independent Socialist Party of Germany, and they break off from the SPD. Now I believe this was because they didn't agree with Germany's war, because they were socialists, so they said, why should we fight for, the bosses, the capitalists, when we should just be free? This isn't our war, this is an imperialistic war. So they sort of qualify. They're not as hardline as the KPD, but they're not as liberal, they're not as, centrist as the SPD, so they're sort of half communist, half socialist, I would say. Now the yellow are the centrists, so we have the DDP. They were quite popular amongst scholars and things, and the Zentrumpartei. And Zentrum, even though it literally means centre and it's quite easy to place them, they are slightly right of centre, I would say, because they are the Catholic party, so they would be seen as slightly more right of centre. Now in light green we have the right wing, so the BVP and the DVP, for example. And then I would class the DNVP and the NSDAP as far right, especially during this period. The DNVP and actually the DVP as well, they both drift further right towards the NSDAP, which of course would later become the Nazi Party. Now the president would be elected every 7 years, and the president would choose the chancellor as well. Now we have the Reichsrat, which was the regional government representing the states, and I think the amount of people who sat in that government was proportional to how large the state was and how many people were in the state. And we also have the Reichstag, where there were elections every 4 years, although this was pretty fluctuating. A lot of different cabinets sat and fell during this period and during the whole of Weimar. And these guys basically together, if they both agreed on it, they would pass laws. Okay, so first of all, we're going to have a look at the very far left, so the KPD and the USPD. So this is the Spartacist flag, which was used in the Spartacist uprising in and around the 5th of January 1919, when the left-wing extremist communist Spartacists, that's quite a mouthful, tried to take over the Weimar Republic. It was especially in Berlin, but also around Berlin, a few other places. There were quite a few very far left-wing uprisings in Germany at this time, and it's telling that the flag is the same, because basically the Spartacists who weren't killed, unlike, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they decided to take the democratic route of trying to uproot democracy, which I always find hilarious, because they're trying to get rid of democracy by playing along with democracy and using votes to get rid of it. But, that's why I'm not a communist. But the KPD, so they're supported by the lower class working citizens, and that means they have very strong support in industrial areas, because these are the poor guys, these are the ones who are going to benefit from communism, or so they think. So these areas would include the Ruhr, where there was actually an uprising, as well as Hamburg, Saxony, and in Berlin as well. There was quite an industrial scene there, people in the lower classes. So what were they? Well, they were anti-democratic, and they wanted a communist revolution to overthrow the republic. Now, in fact, they were literally traitors, because they were controlled by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in Russia. And if you're not aware, the Soviet Union was a communist. It called itself socialist, but it attempted to become communist, and it was communist in this period. So they actually took their orders directly from Soviet Russia, because they were the big communists on the scene. So all around Europe, these communist parties, they would often look to the Soviet Union. Now, they attempted to overthrow the government in several risings. In 1919, as I've already mentioned, the Spartacist Rising. You also have the Ruhr Rising of 1920, which was at the same time as the Kapp Putsch. They took this upon themselves to form their own Soviet republic in the Ruhr region as the Kapp Putsch was going on, because the government couldn't stop them. Of course, the Kapp Putsch was later stopped by a general strike, and then they sent in the Freikorps and the army, and many hundreds of people were massacred. The Soviet soldiers, the revolutionaries were, as well as the foundation of the Bavarian Socialist Republic in 1919 in Bavaria, which also fell shortly afterwards. Now, after 1924, the KPD sought to destroy the republic from within itself instead of actually going out, having these revolutions, and trying to overthrow them violently. So they try to help the working class, but actually what they do is they end up splitting the vote. So, for example, something that in British politics happens is you have the Labour Party, which is the big quote-unquote left-wing party, and you also have the Green Party, who are the environmental, feminist, hippie guys. I know I'm generalising, but that's sort of who they are. But then what you end up having is people will vote for the Green Party, who are a left-wing party, but that takes votes away from the Labour Party. So essentially they split the vote, which doesn't help them in the long run, which means that the Conservatives on the right end up doing better in the elections because they don't have this other large right-wing party to stop them from getting these votes. And it's sort of the same in Weimar Germany here. Now, moving on to the SPD, who are slightly more centre-left, and these guys are very big in the Weimar Republic. They are basically the founders of the Weimar Republic. So here we have one of their election posters, and as you can see, it says "Gegen Papen, Hitler und Teilmann." And basically it means against Papen. I think he was a Nazi. Hitler, well, obviously he was a Nazi. And Teilmann was the KPD candidate in 1925. And the arrows here are representing, the top one is obviously monarchy with the crown, the second one is Nazism with the swastika, and the third one is communism with the hammer and sickle. And it translates to the SPD against monarchy, Nazism and communism. And that was their stance. It was centre-left. So the SPD were the largest single group in the Reichstag during the period of 1924 to 1928. And they were the founders and the supporters of the democracy, because remember, it was thanks to Friedrich Ebert in 1918, that the Weimar Republic, became a thing after Chancellor Max quit. Now, they only participated in one out of the total of 6 coalitions in this period, which hints at that the democracy isn't working. Now, they had proportional representation, which means that every vote counts. But then this is sort of showing that if they were only in one of the total of 6 coalitions, that they're not really being represented. If the most people are voting for them, why aren't they getting the most, out of the government? Now, they're a left-of-centre party, as I've said, and they become more liberal, but they still hold on to the older socialist values because they are the Sozialistische Partei Deutschland, so the Socialist Party of Germany. And this made it often unacceptable for people on the right of them and on the left of them to work with them, and it made them rather unflexible in government. So they were hard to work with, and they often didn't know which way to go on issues, which meant that it was hard to work with them in a coalition, which might explain why they only got into one out of the total of 6. And the voters for these guys would include industrial workers and trade unionists, so it's sort of the working class, not quite as maybe poor as the people who would vote KPD and USPD, but sort of still the working class. Now, they weren't particularly popular with youngsters or with women, and they definitely weren't popular with the middle class because, quite rightfully, they were the ones who caused inflation, which hit the middle class really hard. Now, moving on to Zentrum, to the Centre Party. Now, here we have the Wer schützt Familie, Heimat und Arbeit, das Zentrum. So, what that basically means is who protects the family. Now, Heimat is quite a difficult one to translate. It's sort of its region, its district, its area, locality, that kind of thing. It's very important in Germany. And work, the Centre Party. Now, das Zentrum literally means the centre, and it's pretty central in politics. It's slightly right of centre. It is the Roman Catholic Party, but that's their stance. So they protect things like traditional values, the region, the sort of local area, and also, work. That's a massive thing for Weimar. Now, it's the party for the defence of the Roman Catholic population, and they were persecuted quite heavily under the German Empire, Bismarck really didn't like Catholics, and he actually passed several laws barring Catholics from getting into higher positions. Now, there was quite a large Roman Catholic population in Germany, especially in the south as well as the west. So along the Rhine, you have quite a lot of Catholics living there, so i.e. in the Ruhr, the Saar and the Rhineland. Now, because the party was founded along religious lines rather than social lines, it had massive appeal. Basically, if you have this whole Catholic population, anyone who's Catholic has a vested interest to vote for Zentrum. Whereas if you are, say, voting for the SPD, then it's a very specific group of, industrial guys. Because if you're a right-winger, you're not going to vote for the SPD. But you can be a left-winger, an industrial guy, and a Catholic, and you'll vote for the SPD. Or you can be a rich landowner in the south, a right-winger, and still vote for Zentrum, So it's quite a clever party in that way. It can get quite a few votes, and they were in every major coalition during this period. But it's slightly more difficult for Zentrum because they have such a wide support base to vote on certain issues, because obviously the industrial worker who's a Catholic is going to have very different ideas to the landowner who's Catholic. And yeah, it is the central party, but it's slightly further to the right than being exactly in the centre of politics. And it shifted further right in 1928 under the leadership of Heinrich Brüning. Now moving on to the DDP and the DVP. Now this one is Wählte meine Partei, die Deutsche Volkspartei. Vote for my party, the German People's Party. And here is the motto for the DVP. It says, fair work for everyone in the city and the countryside. From the left, from the right, against dictators. German Democratic Party. And these are centrist / right-wing parties. So the DVP, it stands for the German People's Party. Now, a very clever trick to decide upon whether a party just based on the name is on the left or the right. If there is a P in it, they are often on the left, but as you can see, these two aren't. If there is a V in it, they are likely going to be on the right. There aren't any left-wing parties with Vs in them. So they were part of every major coalition during this period, meaning that the centre-right parties generally do quite well in this era. They're supported by both the academics and by the industrialists. And after the very successful career of Gustav Stresemann, who I've mentioned several times, 0% stress, 100% the man, the party shifted further to the right wing to fit with the times. Now, the DDP are the German Democratic Party, and they're also supportive of the democracy and of the Weimar Republic. Now, like the DVP, it's also been part of every major coalition in this period, meaning that these smaller, slightly right-wing parties, they tend to do quite well. And it drew support as well from academics and professional groups, but it's slightly unclear what they actually stood for, so they became less and less popular as time goes on. Because obviously if you're voting for the communists, you know what you're going in for. If you're voting for the DVNP, or the DNVP, I always get it mixed up. I think it's let's just go with it. You know what you're going to get. You know what they stand for, but these centre parties, it's slightly greyer. You don't really know as strongly what you're going to vote for. Now, DNVP, there you go. The DNVP, now this one. Wählt schwarz, weiß, rot. Das ist Deutschnational. So vote black, white, red. That is Germany. And the black, white, red is in reference to the old German imperial flag. And the DNVP is the Deutsches Nationalistische Volkspartei, which is the German Nationalist People's Party, or the German Nation People's Party, as I've put there. So they're traditionally the party that's supported by landowners, especially in the east of Germany, the old guys. So the east of Germany would be, for example, Prussia, which is the state that was dominant in the old German Reich. So by the 1920s, their support base has expanded considerably to include industrialists and professional groups, and even some of the workers who might traditionally have voted Communist or SPD, because they stand for the nation, they stand for the old empire, and they want to return to those ways. Because if you think about it, life was a lot better under the empire, even if the SPD were promising so-called social welfare reforms and more equality, that kind of thing. Life was still better under the empire, so many people wanted to go back to those sort of days, and so they voted for parties like the DNVP. Now, their stance was anti-republican, anti-Treaty of Versailles, and they often refused to enter coalitions with other parties. And the SPD really didn't like them because, well, they're anti-everything the SPD stand for. So the SPD also actually refused to govern alongside the DNVP, which just complicates things. Now, in 1926, they actually do join a cabinet under Hans Luther and that of Wilhelm Marx in 1927. But it doesn't really work out for them, and in 1928 they lose a lot of support to what's called the Grand Coalition, and they return to their anti-democratic way of thinking. And with the leadership of Hugenberg in 1929, it entered into an alliance with the NSDAP, and then obviously moved further right, because, well, if you're working with the Nazis, you're going to move further right. And again, here is another poster for them. A lot of their sort of iconography symbolism relates back to the Old Reich. Now, this literally translates to "down with the internationals, vote German nationalists." And as you can see, there are a group of men, I assume, are raising the old German imperial flag, and in the corner there you can see the new flag, the gold, red and black banner of the Weimar Republic, drifting to the ground. Now, with another trek right, we land at the doorstep of Adolf Hitler and the NSDAP, often shortened to the Nazi Party. Now, it stood for the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, and the party turned to democratic means after it failed in the Munich beer hall putsch of 1923, when a lot of its leadership and membership actually, as well as Adolf Hitler, who became the leader, were thrown in jail because obviously they were terrorists. Through much of this period, Hitler wasn't actually allowed to speak. He was only allowed to speak in public. Well, not allowed to speak. Hitler could speak, but not speak in public until about 1927. And his stormtroopers, who are often shortened to SA, and the very party, the NSDAP, were also banned up until this time. Now, in this era, Hitler uses it to sort of reorganize the party, and he becomes the very nucleus of power in the NSDAP. He makes sure there's no one else who's countering his arguments in the party, and he becomes the sole leader. Now, though they lost 100,000 votes in the 1928 election to this Grand Coalition, which had a broad base, I think stretching from SDP right the way into the right wing, they do start to gain a following among the Protestant farmers in the north, because obviously you have the Catholics in the south who will vote Zentrum. You have, the niche of the communists, the socialists, that kind of thing. So Hitler and the NSDAP, they try and get into the rural population, because the urban population, they were going down the route of the left wing, going down the route of cabaret, of showiness, of homosexuality, openness, liberalness, the musics, the arts, surrealism. And in the countryside, people were very much still traditional, and Hitler exploits this niche, and he starts to get people there to vote for the NSDAP, although at this period it's still very small and they don't do particularly well. Now, they also campaign against the Young Plan, which I mentioned in a previous video about the economics of the Weimar Republic and how they tried to pay the reparations. But this campaign against the Young Plan, which was really stupid, basically, in my opinion, because this campaign is basically saying, well, we're not going to apply any of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. We're going to invade all the territory taken off us by the Treaty of Versailles, and we're basically going to shove a big, huge middle finger in the face of the Allies. That was their plan. I think it was called something like the Freedom Plan, or the Freedom, something along those lines, but that was their plan. But by doing this, Hitler does give himself good exposure and makes a name for himself, which is as good as anything. Now, if you've been following the US election, you know that the media have said pretty much anything about Donald Trump, and terrible, but as the old saying goes, any publicity is good publicity. And with the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, you can clearly see that there are two main branches to the name. You have nationalist on the one hand and socialist, and you can see this in the iconography and in the posters of the Nazi Party at this time. Now, this one reads, "Saxons free from Marxist stupidity, vote nationalist socialist." And this is clearly a sort of nationalist symbolism going on here, with the big strong man, forking up the, I think that's probably a little Jewish guy who's a Marxist as well by the looks of things, to show, that the Germans are strong and the proud Aryan roots of their race. But in the bottom one, it says, "Worker, your head, your fist, vote for the front soldier, Hitler." And this is a lot more socialist. You have, again, the strong man looking over, huge muscles in his shirt. He's dirty from working. He's a hard worker. He's a labourer with his hammer. And again, this looks a lot more like socialism. So if the Nazi Party play their cards right, they can hook into both the right wing, the old monarchist, the old guard, the nationalists who want to make Germany a great country again, as well as the socialists on the left who are just workers. So if they can do this right, which they end up doing, tragically, then the Nazi Party was a force to be reckoned with. But in this period, they didn't really do their cards right. They weren't really a major figure in politics, but they definitely would be in about 3 years' time. Alright, so this has been my video on the political parties active in Weimar from 1924 to 1928, the so-called Golden Age of Weimar. So I really hope that this has been somewhat informative and that you've learned something, that you've enjoyed it maybe, and that it hasn't been too boring, because there's been a lot of text and this is a very long video. But if you'd like to see more of this kind of thing, if you'd like to know more about anything, or you'd like some additional revision guide help thing, just leave a comment below and I'd be happy to send it to you. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching, and I will let you go now. So thanks very much for watching. As I just said, this has been History with Hilbert, hoping to see you again soon.